Hi, everybody.
Okay, continue.
Um, I have a very special guest this week. I have the author, Gary Lachman, who, last I look, has written about 21 books. They're pretty, they cover the waterfront of esotericism and consciousness and culture. Can't recommend them enough. So in fact, before this, what prompted me to even reach out to you is I went on a little Gary Lachman binge. I read your last 3 books in succession. Fantastic stuff. So just a little bit about who you are and how you came to write on these topics.
Well, first off, thank you for having me on the podcast. I've always, well, not always, I mean, many years ago, and in an earlier past life when I was a musician in the late 70s and early 80s, but I came across a book by a British writer named Colin Wilson, and the book was called The Occult. And there was sort of an occult boom going on at that time. It started in the mid-60s, and I'd actually written a book about that called Turn Off Your Mind, about the occult influence on pop culture in the 1960s. But by about the mid-70s, it had blossomed into a whole sort of genre of music and literature and all that. Any case, I didn't have any interest in that sort of stuff at all, aside from sort of horror fiction, H.P. Lovecraft and weird tales, that kind of stuff, and horror films. But I came across this book, and I started reading it, and it was just a fantastic book. It was just very well written, and it was a history of the occult, but from a perspective of a kind of existential philosophy, which is a bit of a mouthful. And I had read that kind of stuff, Sartre and Camus and Nietzsche and that sort of thing. So I had some idea what that was about. But this writer, Colin Wilson, I didn't know he sort of started out as a sort of British existentialist with his first book, The Outsider. So I didn't know he had this whole kind of decade prior to this book, The Occult. Any case, long story short, it just blew me away how he wrote about it, because it was a narrative, a history, but it was from this perspective of a kind of philosophy of consciousness. It wasn't about, just spooky stories or spells or candles and stuff like that. And at the same time, where I was living in New York on the Bowery, and this was back in the day when the Bowery was the Bowery. A good deal of it isn't anymore. It's all very built up. And if you go there, and if you ever knew the place back in the time I lived in it, you wouldn't recognize it. Funnily enough, except for the building in which I used to live, which is still a dump. So people are living there now. Sorry, I don't mean to be insulting, but I was actually relieved to see that this building was still in exactly the same shape it was 45 years ago. At least the exterior was. But any case, where we were living on this loft space on the Bowery, just a block away from this club CBGB, which was really big and famous at the time. The other band members I was living with, they had a kitschy kind of interest in the occult, and they had some voodoo dolls and upside down crosses and things like that. But there was this very flamboyant gay artist guy who was into the Hells Angels, but he was also into Aleister Crowley, and had a Crowley tarot deck. And he used to do these impromptu tarot readings and all this kind of stuff. So I just found myself in this milieu with all this kind of occult stuff going on. And I just took to it, and it became fascinating for me. And many years later, I wound up starting to write about it. First book reviews and articles, and then gradually, by about 2000, my first book came out. So for the last 20 years, I've been sort of writing about it fairly regularly, as you said. Yeah, more or less about 21, 22 books, so more or less a book a year on these topics. And I usually say it started out as a naive enthusiasm for weird stuff, and it gradually became a serious kind of study of weird stuff. So there you go.
Well, you can really see an evolution. So, I mean, the earlier stuff that I read of yours, which would have been the Uspensky book and the Steiner book, and in the Jung book, which is a little later, but they're quite topical. But then books like The Secret History of Consciousness or Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. Those books are like tour de forces.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, so I can really see how you're working something out, and maybe we can. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think well, to tell you the truth, I mean, what I like to do is write the kind of books that I like to read. And the books I like to read are books that bring a lot of stuff together.
Yeah.
Like make connections. And this is what this writer, Colin Wilson, did throughout his life. I mean, he died in 2013. And subsequent to my reading this book in 1975, I came to London, I came to England. I went on a pilgrimage in 1983 down to Cornwall, where he lived from the late 50s until when he died in 2013. And I mean, many other people did this. He had this house down. I mean, when he first moved down there in '57, I mean, nobody else lived there, so it was all kind of end of the world kind of landscape with the English Channel, just a short walk down the road on the cliffs. But subsequently, it's all got built up. And when he first lived down there, it was sort of no man's land. But he had this house, and it became a kind of pilgrimage spot for lots of people going there. And I made my pilgrimage in 1983. I went on what I call a mini search for the miraculous with a friend of mine from Los Angeles, and we were both in the Gurdjieff work at
You were.
this time. Yeah. And Gurdjieff, for those who don't know, is enigmatic, esoteric teacher, Greek Armenian, who developed this whole system of sort of psychological development in the 20s and 30s and all that. And in the early 1980s, I got involved in it. And at this time, among other things, we went to different sort of places. We went to Chartres and Glastonbury, and then we found Gurdjieff had what he called his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in this chateau in Fontainebleau outside of Paris. So we made a pilgrimage there. But I went on a separate individual pilgrimage down to Cornwall to meet Colin Wilson. By this time, I was just mad about his books and reading all of them, and he wrote over 100 books, so there's a lot to read. But in any case, what he did in so many of his books was he would read everything about the subject and topic, and then he would make these connections between different writers and different thinkers and different ideas. And so I just found myself doing that as well. And the book you mentioned, Secret History of Consciousness, which came out in 2003, I mean, that was basically what I had been reading about for the last 30 years. So I just kind of had an opportunity to say, okay, here, this is all this other stuff. And it was also something, I mean, one of the things that I think is important about Wilson, and more or less what I'm kind of doing is kind of carrying on his tradition, is that there's lots of stuff about consciousness these days. It's a very popular topic, but it's usually either sort of from the scientific point of view, or the spiritual, or the psychedelic. And what Wilson pursued was a sort of existential, phenomenological, more, again, that's another mouthful, but it's more about a kind of mapping out of your own consciousness, your own experience of it, paying attention to your own kind of consciousness, which is fundamentally what phenomenology is about. And I won't go into great detail about that, but it's another kind of tradition, a way of doing this that hasn't really settled into a niche in where these other ones have. And so I kind of feel like that's what I'm sort of doing. And also Lost Knowledge Imagination. This was another thing where, this phrase, the Lost Knowledge Imagination, came from a British poet, Kathleen Raine. She was a Blake scholar and an essayist and a poet. And she had this whole idea of that there was a whole kind of lost teaching or rejected knowledge or lost tradition of the imagination, which she associated with the Romantic poets, Blake and Keats and Shelley and Coleridge, and then later Yeats. And then also sort of with Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy and so on and so on. And I took that idea and in a relatively short book, just connected it to other sort of people that I've been reading. So yeah, I like doing that. And actually, in a way, it's a kind of approach to writing or writing books that used to be more popular and kind of there was more of it, say in the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, and then sort of by the 80s there was a sort of specialization.
Yeah.
You had to be an expert on this, and the whole idea of the kind of the general, you know, well-read, literate, either author who could write about a wide variety of things, connecting them, and the reader who was interested in that. That kind of started to turn into very old school kind of thing. And I guess that was how I grew up, you know, my intellectual, insofar as I have one, education, you know, came from that kind of background. So that's the kind of books I like to write.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that, you know, I think that was really apt when you described how consciousness now is sort of pigeonholed. I mean, if you look on, I have a resistance recovery closed Facebook group, and a lot of the postings, you know, we got this renaissance of the psychedelics going on. And then we also have some, and oftentimes fairly spiritual insights coming out of neuroscience, at least them looking at Buddhist practice, meditation, and such.
Or finding the God spot.
What's that?
Finding the God spot.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And this stuff's all very, you know, it's great, but like you're saying, it's all either, you know, functional MRI with some guy who's done 2,000 hours of meditation, or as my people say, tripping balls. And there's not this, you know, this other realm of what's going on when you read the poem, write the poem, get taken by the piece of literature, the dream that stays with you, the Jungian big dream. And that's why, I mean, this book, people, this book is just something else, because this is the kind of book I fantasize about writing, because what Gary's done is he's brought a bunch of thinkers that are, like he was saying, pretty marginalized into dialogue with each other. And Henri Corbin and Steiner, Owen Barfield, I mean, my God. And the way you set the book up, maybe this would be helpful, that you set it up talking about how since the Enlightenment, we've all kind of been born into a paradigm that has certain psychological consequences.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, what imagination, I mean, we tend to think imagination, it's either make believe, that's just your imagination. It's kind of the opposite of reality. It's fantasy in that kind of way, or it's, you know, the cutting edge. It's innovative. You know, it's the next step and the next big thing, whatever it is, in whatever area you're working in. And of course, we still recognize it in the creative works of, you know, painting and music and film and all that and so on. But as I said earlier, this poet Kathleen Raine, she recognized that there was actually a whole kind of tradition in which the imagination was not an alternative to reality. It's a reality in itself, and it actually enables us to understand aspects of what we call reality that aren't immediately accessible, and they're not accessible to the senses. But what happened, the big change that happened in the early 17th century was the start of what we know now as science. And this was, fundamentally, it was a rejection of metaphysics, a rejection of spirituality, in the sense that there was some other world that was somehow prior to the physical world that we all live in, you know, and our world now is just a reflection of this higher world. And they said, well, let's put that aside and let's just pay attention to what's happening in the actual physical world. And what we can do is we've learned we can measure things. You know, we can get precise measurements about things in the physical kind of world, in the material world. And this is what enabled us to, you know, nowadays have this kind of conversation over the computer and you know, go to the moon and all this kind of thing. It worked enormous marvels and wonderful, you know, advances in human life and all that. But it came at a price, and the price was something along the lines of the soul. It goes back to the, you know, the saying, you know, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? In one sense, the West as a whole culture gained the world because we've mastered the world by now. You know, I mean, for better or worse, we've become masters of reality because we can pretty much do whatever we want. But it came at a price because in order to do that, we had to empty the world, you know, nature, clouds and trees and mountains and stars. We had to empty them of any kind of inner content, you know, and any kind of inner meaning, which they used to have prior to this. You know, the angels moved the stars. And in order for us to understand, you know, the laws of planetary motion, we had to kick the angels off the planets and just get down to, you know, what we could actually, you know, study in terms of quantitative measurements. And this is the thing that happened. Imagination got increasingly sidelined and marginalized till today. It's something that, you know, in some way people think you can teach it in a class in some way, as if it's a specific kind of faculty that you can kind of teach in some way. And according to the people I talk about in this book, it isn't quite like that. It's a whole way. It's not about make believe. It's about making real. It's about it's a faculty we have in order to perceive dimensions and depths of reality that are not accessible to the senses. I mean, that sounds very dry, but that's what it is. And we use it all the time, and we don't even know that we use it all the time. Because if imagination wasn't in some way binding our experience together, it would all kind of break up into, you know, kind of disparate parts. I mean, in the book, I call it an intuitive glue that kind of holds the picture together, the picture of the world. I mean, one of the things that we grow up being taught is that the world is just out there. And when we open our eyes, we're just mirrors, or we're cameras. We're just reflecting what's out there already. But what many of the people I talk about in the book came to understand is that actually below our conscious perception of things, there's a whole, you know, processes going on in which we're basically forming the picture of the world that we see. So what we naively believe to be just the world, as we innocently see it when we open our eyes, is something that on an unconscious or subconscious level, our minds have already shaped and formed into this picture that we have. And that's a kind of work of the imagination that, you know, we're not aware of. And so this is the thing where it's, the sad thing about this, I'm sorry I'm saying it this way, but the sad thing about this is that the imagination isn't going to help in any kind of quantitative, profitable way, even though there's lots of books about how to use your imagination in the office and, you know, in a variety of other work ways. It's really about something that's got nothing to do with that. The reason this practical, you know, functional, utilitarian approach to reality became so dominant and so successful is that it was aimed at actually having visible results of something. You know, there was a practical result. Imagination isn't going to affect the price of tea in China, but it will increase your experience of that cup of tea you have. Yeah, that's the thing. And it's this non-quantitative, implicit kind of dimension of value that our imagination provides, is the thing that because the whole Western, and not only Western, just in general, kind of utilitarian practical view of life, wants to put it aside, because it's not about that. And, you know, as you know in the book, this gets into left brain and right brain and the whole kind of tussle between the two of them. But this is the sad thing, is like, we can't argue that, yes, the imagination is good because it's going to do X. It's not going to do X. What it's going to do is it's going to increase and enhance and deepen, enrichen your experience of the world you're already having. And this is a hard thing to sell.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to sell, but what's so interesting listening to you is, you know, we live in this time where, especially with spiritual matters, everything's commodified.
Oh, that's it.
You know, whether it's the yoga journal or the tarot reading or the tithing to the church, I guess. But it's almost like there's something about imagination that's resisting the machinations of the world in a way.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say, clumsily in my last sort of, tirade there. And I mentioned left and right brain. And I talk about in this book, Lost Knowledge Imagination, and also the book I wrote before then called Secret Teachers of the Western World, which is a sort of overall narrative history of the West, but from this point of view of this other counter tradition, this hidden or lost tradition of the imagination, of the esoteric and all that. But also seen through the lens of this wonderful book called The Master and Its Emissary that came out about 10 years or so ago by Ian McGilchrist, who is he's a neuroscientist, but he was also an English scholar and writing about poets. So he's got 1 foot in each camp, in the scientific camp and also in the humanities and all that. And what's important about this book, it's a huge tome, and it's the research and references are dazzling. But the fundamental insight, he reboots the left and right brain discussion, which got really heated up in the 80s, and then it kind of lost in the 90s because the neuroscientists didn't want to keep studying it because too many pop psychologists and new age people were picking up on it. And it kind of lost. And then they found out, it was like left brain scientists, right brain artists, yes, in a general sense, but as we discovered, both brains actually do both things. But what McGilchrist said is, yes, they may do the same things, but they do them very differently. So it's not a question of what they do, it's how they do it. And the right brain, which he posits as being older, that's what it's the master, and the left brain is the emissary, presents a global, total, large, holistic picture of things that is necessarily vague because it is a general, total picture. But it communicates what in Lost Knowledge I say are these implicit meanings. It's a kind of meaning that you feel, but you can't quite pinpoint it precisely. But that's what the left brain does. The left brain unpacks this big, global, fuzzy, vague. I mean fuzzy and vague in the sense, like if you listen to a piece of music and it's like it moves you and it means something, but you'd be hard pressed to say, well, there, right there, that note means. You can't do that. It just it just wouldn't work that way. But you just have a sense it means something. I can't say exactly what it means. Or it's the same kind of phenomena in a way as when you have somebody's name or the name of something on the tip of your tongue. Well, you know it, but you can't say it. And this is because the right brain doesn't communicate in language. It communicates in images and symbols, metaphors, poetry, allegory, and even physical sensation. The left brain is incredibly precise, and its job is to unpack this larger global kind of picture. And the right brain sees the forest, the left brain sees the trees, it sees the individual branches on the trees, it sees the individual leaves on the branches, it sees the individual cells on the leaves on the branches, and it goes down and down and down to closer and closer fine tuning. And we're really good at that. The whole scientific project, which started 4 centuries ago, is all about that. But what you gain in precision, you lose in meaning. You lose the connection to the larger kind of thing. The larger thing you feel, but you can't say precisely. But it can only be communicated through gesture or art, metaphor. Science doesn't want metaphor, it wants precise, prosaic formulae. It can get those, but it loses the connection. So we have both of them. And, but what happened is that precision, that accuracy sort of became increasingly dominant, 4 centuries ago. Until now, the other side, this larger global implicit kind of perception of things has become, over on the side. And that's the knowledge of the imagination is that kind of, and that's what I was saying before, how it's a real change in how we understand things. It doesn't mean let's get rid of the left brain, let's get rid of science. No, absolutely not. We need all that. But let's bring back in this other side of things. And you mentioned before we started recording about soul, and how there's a lack of soul or an absence in soul in many or most of the kind of rehabilitation programs dealing with addiction and all that. And I'm not surprised, because there's a lack of soul in pretty much everything out there. It's all become marginalized, and in some way, we need to bring that back in.
Yeah, it's so if you, and I wouldn't recommend this to anybody, but if you were to study psychology, clinical psychology, you may get, you have to take a personality theory class or something. And you'll notice that, we're reading about Freud and Jung, and there's still literally soul is in currency as a term. But by the time you get now, you're preparing to be a social worker or a counselor, the metaphor of the human being that's just driven down your throat is more or less we're a biocomputer, a neurochemical biocomputer. And so the treatment modalities are always they're always thinking, and they're always behavioral. And this whole middle realm of soul and feeling and memory and all that, it's completely neglected. And in fact, the only thing they really know to do with it within the system is to medicate it. Your affect bothers you, take this pill. But we're trying to change the things that can be measured,
Well, that's the thing they can tinker around with, and they can have charts about and some kind of, but the other stuff is like, how do you measure that? You can't measure it in that kind of precise way. And that's the problem. I mean, some people, obviously some people have tried to do this. You mentioned Jung. I know within the Jungian world, was it James Hillman? This notion of returning soul, Thomas More, turned it into some best-selling books and all that. And, but, it's something that was taken seriously up until that time. If you look prior to the rise of science in the early 17th century, and during the Renaissance, people like Marsilio Ficino, whom James Hillman draws on quite a bit, he had a whole kind of psychotherapy based on the notion of soul, and how you can somehow treat melancholy or a variety of other sorts of afflictions by somehow addressing the hungers and needs and appetites of the inner world. And this is, I mean, the last book I did, you said you read the most recent ones, The Return of Holy Russia, which I wound up writing History of Russia, which I never thought I'd wind up writing who thought I would wind up, ex-punk rocker writing a history of Russia? Anything can happen.
I think it's very punk rock.
But that's one of the things, it's the soul. This was something that Russian philosophy and Russian thought, when it came into its own in the 19th century, it overwhelmed the West. People, I write in the book about how people like Robert Louis Stevenson and others, they said that they couldn't finish reading Dostoevsky because it was just too powerful. And it was because the West had just jettisoned, or at least marginalized, these kind of questions. And that's what all the Russian psyche was about. What's the meaning of life? Why do I exist? All that kind of thing. And Dostoevsky says in Notes from Underground, where he has the underground man say that if you could prove to me that the universe was this wonderful logical system of cogs and wheels, and in the end everything worked out for the best, the greatest good for the greatest number, and so on, I would still go insane on purpose, just to prove that I am free. And that's that ornery, incorrigible part of us that is the soul. And it's got nothing to do with making sure everyone's fed and clothed and have decent living spaces, which there's nothing wrong with that. Of course we want all that, but that's not enough. Man does not live by bread alone. And the other stuff that isn't the bread is the stuff that feeds the soul. And sadly, we've and this is McGilchrist's argument, is that, in very general terms, we've increasingly created this left brain kind of world around us, which just doesn't treat anything like that. It wants to more. I mean, how they worked is a kind of, what's the word? friendly feud going on between them. There's sort of a, you know, a rivalry going on between the two sides. And as the American political or government system should work, in Congress, there's a system of checks and balances. So what they do is they inhibit each other's excesses. So normally, if the left got too excessive, the right would somehow inhibit that, and vice versa. But somehow down the line, the left has increasingly got more in charge, and it's taken over, and it's marginalized the right. So the right, and the right can't, that's the thing, the right doesn't speak in the kind of precise language that the left would understand. It speaks in hunches, it speaks in symbols, it speaks in metaphors, it speaks in poetry. Here recently, I saw on the news that because of COVID-19, which is a handy reason for lots of things to happen, poetry apparently has now been jettisoned from the, you know, the British school system.
Really?
You know, because somehow they had to cut, the budget cuts demanded something, had to go. And it's like poetry, and it's just like, well, you know, it's like poetry is what is it nowadays? You know, it's this kind, it's like opera at best, you know, sort of something that, yes, we know it's important, but, you know, every now and then maybe we'll pick up a book of poems. But that is another kind of example of this kind of increasing, more left, you know, prosaic kind of way of looking at things and quantitative things. And it's a shame, because I really feel like we have to fight for this in some way.
Yeah.
You know, we have to fight to keep it. And it's not a fight, we can't go protest this fight. We can't tear down statues about this fight. This is a different kind of, we can't occupy Wall Street about this fight. No. This is a whole other kind of interior terrain that we have to kind of, I would feel somehow in ourselves, we have to come to understand and occupy, and then, you know, in some way ensure that it's not taken over by these other forces that in many ways just, and again, the strange thing is that it's well-meaning. It's supposed to be aiming towards making everything better.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I think about, I think I was born in 1963. So you and I are of an age. But this thing you mentioned earlier about, you know, Camus and Sartre and all that, you know, that was kind of in the air when we were coming up. So there's this whole sort of philosophy that was born of this, you know, this alienation from the world, this sort of just overwhelming self-consciousness, this kind of inwardness, we're cut off. And I feel like that, you know, we've kind of gone past that, in that culturally there has been on some level a reaction to everything you're talking about.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes it's not very conscious or productive, you know, so sometimes I think it's symptomatic. Like I think it was Barfield, or both Barfield and Jung said, you know, we disenchanted the world out here, and now all the spirits have come in here, and many of them are like pathologies. But I also feel like something like the counterculture, drug abuse, sexual excess, rock and roll, and all the rest of it is this sort of Dionysian, you know, reaction against all that. Does that ring true?
Oh, I mean, no, sure. I mean, that's always, well, that's generally how it is. You know, if it's if you feel too clamped down, then we want to, you know, throw off, you know, kick out the jams and just go for it. And that's traditionally a way. I mean, it's Dionysian in that sense of excess, but it's somehow, I mean, well, okay, well, it's in some ways it's not quite as Dionysian as the original Dionysian ones, where the Maenads are ripping, you know, children apart and eating them. So, okay, I mean, I'm sure some people are maybe doing that somewhere, and you could probably find it on the net if you really look for it. But at the same time, our excess doesn't have that kind of spiritual background to it, because the excess was supposed to somehow ignite that little spark of soul that you still possess, the spark of the Godhead, and then you were part. But it's this notion of getting out of your own personal consciousness into something bigger, and that could happen at a football match, you know, it happened at a rock concert, and all that kind of thing. But I think also, you know, somehow this whole, the movement towards excess is it happens because there's nothing else. You know, in the absence of any kind of, you know, in the absence of any kind of shared narrative of what the heck is going on, you know, what's the world about now? You know, it's kind of become the one way that people can find some relief from the increasing pressures of the post everything world that we live in. I mean, the world's just becoming more and more complex. If nothing else, the world's becoming more and more complex. You know, and the complexity is not necessarily leading to a better life for everybody. In fact, it's leading to, you know, lives that seem incredibly stressful and lead to the kinds of, you know, behavior patterns that you're talking about. And so, I mean, one of the people I write about or have written about is the notorious dark magician Aleister Crowley. You know, one of the last great magician of the 20th century. And he was one of the people that, when I first got into this stuff, that I learned about, and mostly because of the drugs connection. You know, he wrote a book called Diary of a Drug Fiend, which is still a fun read. And but, you know, talk about excess. This was something that he was completely into. You know, excess in all directions was a kind of motto of his, which I always thought was that's a great title for some heavy metal band, you know, some album for them. But it was this notion of just excess. And in one way, you know, I'm glad he did that, because I think he showed, for those who can see, that that doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, it does. You have moments of this kind of liberation and release and all that, but in a way, you know, once that release has happened, you still have to kind of deal with the world. You still have to develop some routine in which you can handle the world and prosper and get on and actualize yourself. And Crowley always talked about just finding your true will and all that, but that basically meant for him that, you know, everybody should get out of his way and just let him do what he really wanted to do. And he was a spoiled rich kid who basically had everything handed to him when he was young, and then he just expected the world to be like that after that. And I'm not saying that there weren't good things about him. He did have insights. He was brilliant at times. He had more than a touch of genius. But in the long run, I think we do, you know, owe him a round of applause for showing that this kind of attempt to, you know, get over the hurdle of the burden of our individual consciousness by trying to throw it off in terms of excess doesn't work, you know. So we have to learn other ways to do it. And I would say it's got to do more about, rather than trying to throw off the burden of individual consciousness, and we have to, let's face it, it is a burden, you know. It's not fun, but we have to somehow map out in our own awareness of ourselves that those terrains in which we do feel a momentary widening of our consciousness in some ways, as you said, you know, reading poetry or listening to music, looking at a sunset. I mean, I've written an article about I've written an article recently about a strange experience I had during lockdown here, when one morning I went out. I have a little garden over here. I went out and I looked up, and I said, "What's that?" And I was surprised by the sun. And it sounds ridiculous, but it's just sort of like, I mean, of course I know what that is, but at the same time, it suddenly struck me as something strange and unknown and all that kind of thing. And for a brief moment, I was seeing it in this other kind of way, in a way that isn't usual and habitual, and which is the kind of thing that the meditation and variety of different exercises about consciousness and all that is about, you know, trying to induce, or the effect that good poetry does have on us, or music, or other things like that, or, you know, a spring morning or something. But that's the kind of thing I think, you know, I would say we have to patiently try to be aware of those kind of moments and, you know, connect them when we have them at different times. Because I think these sorts of are the moments of a fuller, deeper, more enriched, more imaginative. And I don't mean by make-believe imaginative. I mean somehow feeling a kind of unity in our experience. I think they happen to us more often than we know, than we recognize.
Do you think it's a problematic that the phrase you used earlier, that we didn't have a shared sense of meaning? So even when people recognize that they need to have a more soul-rich life, they're kind of thrown back on their own individual devices.
I think nowadays that's. I mean, not to say people don't. Some people, I'm sure, still get that soulful nutrient from the religion they belong to, whatever it might be. Some people get it from some kind of social group and something like that. But I do think, as a culture at large, especially now, we don't have any kind of shared narrative, and that's a good thing because it frees us up to discover. And it's a difficult thing because if you don't discover something, or you can discover something that, like fast food, it can satisfy your appetite, but in the long run, it's not necessarily good for you. So you might find some spiritual practice of some phony guru or some, bogus something or other that offers this, and that's the other. This is a difficult time. This is a kind of dark night of the soul, I would say, for our culture en masse, because we are thrown back on our own resources. And in a way, the COVID crisis has been a kind of microcosm of that. And I think in a very general historic sense, we've been thrown back on our own resources, and now individually in our own lives, because we've been forced to, limit them.
Yeah.
And, we're thrown back on your own resources. And I don't want to minimize how difficult it has been, for people. It's been horrible. I can't imagine, people stuck in one room and all that kind of thing. But I think that in a way, it kind of, you can see it as a sort of metaphor for what, in a general sense, has been something we've had to deal with for quite some time now.
So Thomas More, James Hillman, the third party of that, there was a little triumvirate. There was a guy named Robert Sardello, who's actually my teacher.
Oh, right. Oh,
yeah, he's great.
I met Robert many years ago.
Oh, you did? Yeah, he'll be on here in a week or two.
All right. Yeah.
And he likes to say, he said, we only develop psychology in the absence of cosmology, or the absence of cosmology is what creates psychology. So we get all individualized and thrown back on ourselves, and we have these, there's a real interesting irony here. I'm having these what appear to be individual issues born of this alienation, and yet you're having them too. So it's almost like we have a shared pathology in the absence of the cosmology. But I find myself wondering, where does this go? Because I can't imagine Western culture, or even sort of the kind of consciousness that's taking over the world, will ever go back into a shared cosmology.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, interesting you say that, because as I get older, I realize at some point my path and that of the world is going to, it's going to bifurcate, and I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years from now. Who knows? I mean, I have certain concerns, and one of the things I think is going to be an important question is the definition of what it means to be human. It's already undergoing change. I mean, the next book I have in mind is something about transhumanism, but I'm going to steal a title from Nietzsche, and transhuman, all too transhuman, because I mean, I think transhumanism is it's a great idea. I shouldn't say this because somebody else is going to take it already, but it's a great idea, but the problem is we're not even human yet.
Yeah.
That's in some way. I mean, a book of mine called presumptuously called Caretakers of the Cosmos is about this whole notion of that we're not really fully human, and I don't mean in a biological evolutionary sense, but I would say in a kind of inner psychological or spiritual kind of sense, and drawing on people like Maslow and others, and also in the esoteric tradition of Swedenborg and the Kabbalah, and this whole notion that we're actually what we have been. We're put into this world in order to repair it. Somehow, when God or whoever made the world, they screwed up. There was a it was a big mistake, lots of problems, and so he called us in to make it better. And our job is actually to put Humpty Dumpty better back together again, and also to make a better Humpty Dumpty, not just to put the broken one back together. So I mean, that's a whole
Yeah, I
other
mean, it looks
story.
like transhumanism is really about taking the broken Humpty Dumpty and giving it steroids.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and what you, no, I don't know, what do you want to say? Transhumanism, it was coined by Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, in the 1960s, in a book, I believe, New Wine for New Bottles. And the idea was that what he was saying was that humanity has become the managing director of its own evolution now. So we've learned enough about ourselves. We're aware of the processes, what's going on, where we know now, perhaps up until now, it's been a blind process that's just happened by chance and so on and so on. But now that we know about it, we are able to make decisions in order to, make evolution ourselves go in the direction we wanted to go into. And so transhumanism was in many ways exactly what I was talking about, in the sense that he was saying what was necessary was the kind of insights into reality that we got from art and culture. It wasn't about survival of the fittest anymore. It wasn't about, the pressure of the environment, because we could choose, we were aware. And what was the transhuman was reaching out to these higher, deeper, more meaningful aspects of our existence that we find in art and the philosophy and all these kinds of things. So it wasn't about computers and cyborg and becoming, all that kind of stuff. And then it got, I don't know who picked it up and turned it into that. I know there was like Are You Serious and Mondo 2000 and all that kind of thing. And I know, is it Ray Kurzweil is sort of doing that. But it's funny you should say that, because I know this notion of Kurzweil, and I think Frank Tipler and some of these other people, about seeding the universe. Life and intelligence has started here on the earth, and we have to, somehow download our consciousness into computers and machines, and we're going to shoot them out into space and go and, seed the rest of the universe and all that. And this was something in some ways that one of these strange characters from this period in Russia that I was writing about, the Silver Age, this guy, Nikolai Fedorov, and he had this whole notion, that what we had to do was revive the dead. This would be the common task that would unite all of mankind. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew that once we recognized that it needed to be done, it would draw us all together. And part of that, and this is how it became fundamentally the kind of Kickstarter for the Russian space program, was that he thought, okay, it'll first start with some person who just died being revived and brought back. Then we realized that we could not forsake our ancestors. We couldn't deny them this miracle. So we'd have to collect all the dust, all the ancient dust from all the graves and all that, and that they would somehow be revived. But some of that dust has left the planet, and it's gone out into space by now. And so not only would we have to go out into space in order to collect that dust, but we'd have to also find habitable planets, because there wouldn't be enough space left on Earth when all the dead have come back. And so it sounds absolutely wild, but again, is this notion of somehow this grand, heroic kind of vision of humanity going out and seeding the planets, which has a grandeur to it. I mean, you have to admit there's an epic character to it, but it does kind of deny the notion that somehow perhaps the universe is already alive. It's already sentient in some way, which we don't immediately understand, but we have a whole tradition in the East and in the West as well of philosophies and teachings that say that in different ways. And I think this will be one of the, if everything works out well, this would be one of the great things that happens sometime in the future, where we actually recognize that the world isn't a what, but a who.
Yeah. Yes. And I think there are thinkers like Steiner, you know, everything's a being. What's interesting about Fedorov?
Fedorov, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the human transhumanists, they're still operating on this notion that death is an absolute evil.
Yeah.
Right. And that there's no meaning to death, or, you know, and Hillman used to always say, soul has a special relationship to beauty and death, because only in the face of that does meaning really, the question and the pursuit of it arise. I want to be sensitive to the time, and the one thing I do want to ask you about, I think this, if I'm not mistaken, you correct me, I think one of a real Gary Lachman idea is your ideas about hypnagogic imagery. That is something I've seen in your work talked about that way that I've never seen anywhere else. I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, hypnagogia, again, it's another mouthful, but it's that term was coined by Andrei Mavromotis, who wrote this wonderful book called Hypnagogia, and it's about this strange state of consciousness that we enter or find ourselves in at least twice a day, and it's the in-between state between sleeping and waking. So as we're drifting off to sleep, and then in the morning or whenever we wake up, as we're waking up, we enter this kind of liminal state. And a strange, if you ever sort of pay attention as you're falling asleep, you can sort of see images at the same time you're aware of your surroundings. So you're kind of awake, still aware of your surroundings, but you start to see these images form in front of you. And they can be faces, they can be sort of geometric patterns, like be any number of things. I mean, I often see a sort of ball being thrown at me as I'm falling asleep, and I kind of go like that and duck it, and then I have a weird kind of body shake. And but you can have different ones as well. And one of the things that other researchers in this strange state of consciousness discovered, especially this fellow who was an early Freudian, Herbert Silberer, is that it's autosymbolic, meaning that the images you see, and you can also hear sentences or words being said to you, are symbolic of either your physical state as you're falling asleep, your mental state, or your emotional state. So it could be something you were thinking about just as you were falling asleep will turn into an image, or some emotional state you're in. So one of the couple things I experienced, I mentioned the ball. The other one is I often see these little men falling downstairs like a slinky. And they are falling down. They're falling asleep. And so am I. So as I am falling asleep, these little men are going down the stairs and that kind of thing. Or one I've mentioned in an article I wrote about this is that I had been reading a book about how Freud and Jung referred a lot to Greek mythology in, describing the unconscious and things of that sort. And I drifted off into a sort of a doze in the afternoon, a nap, after reading this, while I was reading this book. And as I fell asleep, I saw an image of an old kind of cellar doors, the old kind of outside cellar doors that opened up like that. You had to go out. You had to go out of the house to get into them. And as those doors opened up, they kind of opened a little, closed, opened, and then suddenly they opened up. And then all these mythological figures came, like crawling up the stairs from the basement. So that was exactly what I just had been reading about, how the unconscious, which is under, is, the Jung and Freud used a lot of mythological, figures from Greek mythology in order to talk about the unconscious. And they all came up as I was falling asleep. Yeah. I was going down into the basement. The basement doors were opening up, and here we are over here. They came up to greet me. So, and what people like Jung and Steiner and Swedenborg and Uspensky and many, many others learned how to do was to hover in that in-between state, to learn how to stay in it and to watch dreams form. And it's something we can all do. And what's interesting about it, aside from that, is that it's also a state in which a lot of sort of paranormal phenomena can happen. precognition or telepathy or something along those kinds of lines. And I mean, it's something you can find out for yourself, and quite easily. And it's different than a dream because in a dream, you're completely submersed in the dream and you don't have that critical awareness. And it's different from lucid dreaming, in which you wake up in the dream and you're dreaming and you become awake. The hypnagogia, you're awake and you start to dream, and you can sort of watch the dream form. And it's a way you can have, it's many ways, it's what Jung later developed into what he called active imagination, where you could have a dialogue with the unconscious in this way. So, you know, it's something that's a handy way for, you know, people to get in touch with their unconscious.
It's really interesting, though, because the way you treat it makes it much more, you know, it democratizes it. You know, because you Jung and active imagination, suddenly it sounds like some super esoteric thing that the master did. And or Steiner, you know, he's like doing it in front of you and speaking out of it, and you're like,
yeah.
You know, yeah.
Well, I mean, these went out and practiced it and developed it, but I mean, I think in individual experience, it's a way we can enter and observe an altered state in consciousness. No, so someone I know, Jennifer Dumford, she wrote a book called Liminal Dreaming, which is pretty much all about, you know, hypnagogia and a variety of different sort of herbs and sort of stuff you could kind of, incenses you can use to do that. But, you know, if you just kind of try and pay attention as you fall asleep. And I'll tell you though, one thing that you may experience is sleep paralysis, which is a really weird, it's a really weird thing to happen. It's when, when we fall asleep and we get into REM, you know, sleep, and we're dreaming, our muscles go torpid. They just go completely slack. And this is an evolutionary adaptive trait that animals developed ages ago so that they wouldn't move around and act out their dreams. So if they were kind of acting out the dreams, they would be, you know, easy prey for their predators. So evolution in its wisdom had developed a way in which to keep the body still. So that suggests that somehow dreaming is that important. Because if the dreaming itself was something that would be evolutionary unadaptive, right?
Right.
And would lead you to be killed off, then okay, let's get rid of that.
Yeah.
No, we don't get rid of that. We protect that by making you paralyzed, so that you can have the dream and not attract predators. So we still have that now. And this has happened to me so many times, and it's a freaky thing to happen, where you wake up, you're conscious, but your body is still asleep. Your body's paralyzed. And it's a really weird thing. And it's the old hag sitting on you. It's the incubus and succubus, or it can be the sort of a out of the body experience. And but for me, it's generally been a very, very strange thing to find. I can't move.
Yeah, for me, it's always been fairly terrifying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Dreams going on with it is usually pretty dark. Yeah.
Well, this didn't. I recently finished a book about my precognitive dreams, which is a whole other story, but also hypnagogic and sleep paralysis. And I didn't get it. I didn't
wrote a book about it.
Yeah. It's with my editor now, publisher. It's a short. Well, because I gave a talk in London last year about hypnagogic experiences, and then I also tagged on some precognitive stuff because. I've been writing down my dreams for the last 40 years, on and off, different times, but I've collected quite a few precognitive dreams. Dreams in which bits and pieces of the future turn up. And again, this is something that any one of us can find out for ourselves, whether it's true or not. And I would lay even money that if you did, you would find out that it was. That if you just copy down your dreams and pay attention to what happens during the day, you'll see bits and pieces. And I don't mean, you know, having a premonition of some disaster or something like that, which can happen. Those are the ones we most hear about. But it's usually trivial sorts of things. And you have no, why that? But my God, that's the case. I dreamed this last night. And so, so I did a book about that, but the hypnagogia and some bits about sleep paralysis in it. But that's the weird thing, because I'd wake up in a dream, the dream's still going on, I'm aware that I'm lying in bed asleep and paralyzed. And many years ago when I was married, I remember trying to get my, well, I refer to her as my future ex-wife, trying to get her to wake me up, to shake me, because I can't move, and I'm like this, and all I can do is kind of move this, and I'm having some weird dream which I'm fighting off a witch or something, or some creature, and I'm also awake trying to say shake me, and I can just mumble, and I'm aware of my wife's face hovering over me, say, what are you okay, I'm trying to say
No.
And it's like, it's premature burial, you know. It's like, it's like, it's you know, it's a couple not centimeters away from, you know, catalepsy or something like that. But it's a weird experience, and I had multiple consciousnesses, if I could put it that way. So I was aware of the dream, I was still acting in the dream I was in, I was aware that I was lying in bed, you know, paralyzed and couldn't move, and I'm also trying to communicate with, you know, very strange stuff.
So what is the gist of the book? I mean,
it's basically, I've had these precognitive dreams for last 40 years, and I finally decided to write about them. So it's kind of a, you know, short introduction, and there's a chapter that's just basically, I'm just saying, here's a variety of different precognitive dreams I've had, and then there's a chapter on dreams in general, a chapter on time in general, and a chapter on precognition and synchronicity. And then I look at the work of, well, the book that got me going on this was called An Experiment with Time. Again, it was published in the 1920s, and it was by a fellow named J.W. Dunn, who was an aeronautics engineer. So he wasn't an occultist or anything like that whatsoever. But he just discovered, by paying attention to his dreams, that he actually dreamed bits and pieces of the future. And he developed a whole series, this kind of metaphysics of time that, in a way, is kind of irrelevant to the actual experience. You don't have to accept his metaphysics of time, which it's a kind of shaggy dog story with kind of infinite regressive observers in different levels of time. So, but the actual experience he talks about, and you too can discover this is the case. And then there's a British writer who nobody reads anymore named J.B. Priestley, who was very big in the 20th century. But he called himself a time-haunted man. And he wrote some very popular plays that are still put on, Time in the Conways and I Have Been Here Before, which deal with different time theories. And he was actually influenced by P.D. Ouspensky a great deal. Ouspensky's ideas about eternal recurrence and six-dimensional time. And there was somebody who's not as well known named T.C. Lethbridge, who was a British, he started out as a Cambridge archaeologist, and then in his later life, he took up, well, he discovered he could dowse, and then he started using a pendulum, and he developed this whole theory of different levels of time through using the pendulum. I can't go into detail about it. So I kind of say, well, these what these guys thought about it, and look at some contemporary stuff. Dean Radin, who's you know, I guess the big name in parapsychology these days. And there's a very interesting book by a fellow named Eric Wargo called Time Loops.
I read part of that. That's
yeah, I mean, I don't agree with his theory, but it is a very ingenious you know, idea, and it's a wonderful book to plunder. lots of information about different tests about, you know, but again, this is something like, there's even more scientific evidence now for the reality of these things,
right? You know?
So, but that, you know, that's fundamentally what it's about. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it's definitely trending, the whole precog thing right now. Are you aware of this book? We'll finish with this, Prometheus and Atlas.
Is that Jason?
Yeah, who's all
Giorgiani,
because of his alt-right
affiliation. Yeah. I know the name. I haven't read it. So
I'm reading it, and I'm pretty impressed because he really starts with Heidegger, and he says, you know, this notion that we all grow up with that technology is a function of science. He says that couldn't be less true. Technology predates science. And what he's saying about this Enlightenment time is that, in effect, what we did is, he calls it spectral stuff. You could call it paranormal, you could call it soul, you could call it mystical. All that stuff was shuttled off to pursue a certain technological modality, or whatever. But he's saying that, you know, the paranormal is actually evidence that, you know, we're confusing the map with the territory. That the territory really, all these faculties are being inhibited. They're culturally or socially being inhibited. So really,
I think that's spot on, you know, and I would say precisely because this narrow kind of view that has practical application results in things happening out in the world, and it seemed to be, oh well, it works, so it must be true. And the kind of truths that Heidegger, you know, this revealing, this letting be, aletheia, and this kind of thing, you can't do anything with them. I mean, I'm not saying that that's a negative thing, but that's the characteristic of them. They're not something that you can apply in any way, and that's the whole point.
Yeah,
that's the whole point. We've benefited by this, but we've come to associate the notion of truth with practical application and success in that way. And this is a whole other area of our experience in being, you know, of our being, that has become marginalized. And I would say that we somehow have to bring that back in some way. And I don't mean by, I don't want to sound too negative. I don't mean by, you know, everybody going to yoga classes or something. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's a larger kind of thing, you know, it's the sort of thing that at the best of time religion used to provide. But we can't go back to that either. No. We've outgrown that as well. And this is why I feel like we're in this dark night of the soul time, or this kind of, you know, we've cut the apron strings. Initially, that was great. Wow, fantastic. And now we sort of like, where do we go now? We don't really have, or there's multiple directions.
That's right.
That sense.
But in a way, it feels like between, and I'm using this term very broadly, cancel culture. Of, you know, what's the past is whatever, jettison the past, and then this sort of algorithmic high technocracy thing that's sort of foreclosing the future in a way.
Oh yeah,
kind of locked in this, you know, weird sense of present, not in the New Age sense either.
No, I for the longest time I wanted to make a film about in the future where nothing's different at all than how it is now, but it's sometime, you know, everything's exactly the same, but it's in the future. And so, okay, we got rid of all the technological stuff that would make the future special, so it's the future now, and wow, it's a lot like what it was like before, something like that, because the future didn't turn up until, I mean, I guess there was the future in the millennial sense of, you know, Christianity or Judaism, it was heading towards something. But, you know, and the ancients didn't have a sense of the future in that way. It was cyclical. Or was the future was something that was going to come back around again. The future was invented some, you know, 4 or 5 centuries in that sense, you know, for us. And now it's like, I mean, the future's caught up to us. If you put it that way, we are the future already, you know. And that's the thing. It isn't something. The future isn't in the future anymore. It isn't something that's out there. It's in front of us now. And that's it. How should I say it? I remember seeing it was Steve Jobs, and he was selling one of the iPhones or something. It was something about your whole life on a phone. No, sorry. My life is too big. It's not going to fit on the phone. It barely fits in my flat. You know, it's like, no, who wants that?
Well, now it's your whole life in the cloud. Which is
and it's not yours anymore. It's somebody else's.
You know, that's true. And it's like this garage, this sort of digital garage that follows me around. you know, with what I bought in 1997.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, it's yeah. But let us not end on this ominous note. But I think it's true, and I think this goes back to this kind of I don't want to say battle, but it is kind of, you know, it's going to be a guerrilla war of maintaining your own interiority against these forces that and again I'm not, I don't want to be anti-tech and all that, but you know, there's been an exteriorization of the interior over the last several years through technology, I would say, with this kind of the iPhone thing. You can go around and you have this kind of technological interior that you carry around with you on this little kind of packet.
And it gets commodified in data mining.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And somebody's feeding you that, and you already have one. You got one already that you can choose what to put into, instead of like, we want to hand that over to lots of people all the time because it's work. It's work to do that. I can understand, you know, oh my God, Alexa, you choose for me. It's like, Jesus Christ, you know, someone is going to go around blowing those things away. They're going to go to people's houses and they're not going to shoot the people. They're going to they're going to blow away Alexa.
Yeah.
The Alexa murders.
Yeah.
I predict.
And the children will scream bloody murder.
Exactly. It's like, ah!
Yeah. Well, Gary, this has been really wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
I think the audience is going to have a fun time with us. So
I hope so, because I have. So
yeah, I have too.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.